Hey everybody, today I want to talk to you about plants and trees. Now, it's not that you need to really understand the deep botanical, like person's understanding of how these all come together. It's more that we have some keywords and some terms you can use that'll help you with your research. And just like understanding how to name the parts of the body makes you better at like drawing and depicting humans, knowing the parts of the plant is going to help you remember those parts and not forget them. So really quickly, generally, plants have the stuff happening below ground, which is all the roots, and the stuff happening above ground, we traditionally think of as the plant. The root itself has this middle root going through called the taproot, and then these lateral roots moving out to the side. And then the stem is this central piece of the plant that comes up, which shoots off into what are called these vegetative shoots. It has all of these little buds on it, and that's what grows into new shoots or into a flower or something else. We get these things where it sort of sprouts up and it grows up from the ground. Now, leaves themselves have both a blade and a petiole, which is this little central thing that the blade comes off of. And so, if you're making leaves or grass or things like that, they're all generally going to have these parts. But what's important to understand is you have the root system and the shoot system is everything above it. With that, let's take a look at some of the plants you're going to be working with, and I'll jump back and forth between this and Blender, and we'll try to model some. So grass is maybe the simplest kind of plant that we experience on an everyday basis. If you're like me and you grew up in the Midwest, you're used to grass that's a lawn that you mow, you take care of, and it's relatively short. It's like a carpet for outside. Or maybe your background is in sports, and so for you, grass is like a field, a very well manicured golf course or soccer field or football field or something like that. In all these cases, it's the same kind of plant. But if you're maybe like living in a more rural area, you might be used to grass that looks a little bit more like this. That has florets at the end. It has its own buds, even as it flowers and sprouts up. While we think of grass as single blades of grass when we find it in nature, it tends to have these leaves that shoot out like we saw from the plants last time. So if I'm in Blender and I want to make a couple plants, I usually just make them out of a simple flat shape. So take something like this mesh and maybe I build like a plane because I could keep it flat, or let's actually do it this way. If I take a cone like so, and I just set its number of sides to be 3 instead of that higher round, and I make it a little pointier and a little taller, then I can make a simple grass shoot just by taking this object and I can rotate. Now, a little tip here is I'm rotating, but I want it to kind of rotate around the center. So if I press the period key, I can change what it pivots around. In this case, the 3D cursor is right there. So now when I rotate, it'll rotate around this for me, which means if I duplicate it and rotate it around a little bit and maybe even scale it, I can start to create, some nice little variations to this little guy here. Just by kind of clicking on these objects, I can hit L to like link any of these. So hold over it, hit L, duplicate, rotate, maybe like keep just rotating it based on my view. And yeah, it's not perfect, but if we look at this in a scene and I saw a bunch of these scattered around, rotated in their own axes. Oh, gonna return to that. So hit period again. And this time I retained it to the median point, which is sort of the default. So now when I can rotate these and give them some, variation, maybe even just a little bit of scale change. And we get the idea that there is, grass in a field. Then we're thinking about what's ground cover. So these are generally like things like ferns and small like crawling ivy. They tend to be structurally a lot simpler as far as plants. They don't have like usually woody thick stalks. Sometimes too, this can be small trees or shoots or like bushes growing up, very small. So like I have some ferns here, maybe some of these like little leafy things or some ivy. Well, let's make some of that really quick. So I'm going to take these guys and just get rid of these. I'm going to take this and hit F2 to rename this as grass because I want to use that later. And I'll hit H to hide it. It's in there. I also, as a note, this is the same scene as working before. All my rocks are still in here. I just put them all in a collection, which we'll talk about more when we get into terrain. So now I want to make some ground cover. And well, to do that, I need to make a plane and make a leaf. So I'm going to take this plane just like so. I'm going to go into my auto mirror tool, which if I'm in the object mode, it'll auto mirror, but if I'm in this mode, I have to have something selected for it to auto mirror, but I usually use it here. So looks like I got that exact same error. So let's try that again. Make sure I'm selected and auto mirror. Perfect. I just, you have to have something selected, of course. So I take this because I want to shape this into sort of a broad leaf-like shape. So let's go to our top view, hit 1 on our keyboard. Think about this being forward. So I can just take this and shape it leaf-like, maybe add 1 or 2 divisions along it. So again, just kind of carving, something out that feels like a big, broad leaf. And this is where your research comes into play, like looking at different types of leaves and what they look like. And then what I like to do is just go kind of take my little K tool and I cut from here to here. And I have this little stem that I can make kind of coming off the back. And let's narrow that up a little bit. So I have a flat leaf, which, not very inspiring, but same deal. I want to move all this forward so that the pivot point is right there. Same kind of deal I was doing with the grass, because now if I'm rotating along that pivot point, so 3D cursor, and let's rotate from this side, it'll rotate up in one kind of whole point. Now I want to curve the whole thing down. Lots of ways I could do this. I could do it by hand, I could modify it by points, but I want to show you how we can use the proportional modeling. So this little button, if I hit O and I move, I know I can pull it from a spot like so. And if I rotate it, I'm still rotating it from that point, right? Where this is. Let's actually add 2 more divisions along here. And this way. So if I take this, it's still rotating around this point. So when I'm rotating, it wants to rotate there. But I'm rotating this around that point. And so how big my mouse wheel is how much it's going to do that little rotation. So let's rotate it in the x-axis, and then I can just kind of play with this circle till it generally gets the shape that I want. And then from this side view, I just take G and I maybe make this a little bit smaller, scrolling up, because I just want to kind of nudge some of these points around a little bit. Oh, and change this to, again, a median point. So it's around the center of this. So now I have a basic plant shape, and just like before, I like to look at it at the top, and I like to duplicate it, make sure I have 3D cursor, and then rotate it, and duplicate it and rotate it. And then I like to start making some of the different layers to it. So if I take this as a basis for a plant, duplicate it and rotate it, and then I start playing with the scale, like I scale it down and then scale it up in the z-axis, we can start to see it feels a little bit more, with all those little variations we can make to it. It's starting to feel a little bit more like a plant. Rotate it, duplicate it, rotate it. If you look at a plant from a top-down spot, I don't want to be precise with this because actually being a little off is going to make it a little bit more interesting. And then when I'm done with all of these, I just control drag this whole thing together like that. Control J joins them all into one object. Look like they shifted a little bit. So actually before I do that, because it's all got that those modifiers on them, I gotta choose all of these here in my modifier stack. I want to apply all modifiers. That's the modifier add-on, of course. So I take all these and then Control J. Now it's one solid object with its origin down there. I'm going to set that back to median point. And now I have a plant that I can make from the top view, like a bunch of these. Rotate them around and you see I got some nice plant cover. So same way, I'm going to kind of get rid of these other 2 duplicates. I accidentally been tab mode, get these out, and then take this one and I'll name this something like Fern. It's fine, and move that back into the center here. So there we got a plant. Now I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about shrubs and bushes. And, you know, this can be thought of as like, they kind of have like a lot of scales to them. And they're a lot like any other plant, except for instead of having a long stem, they have like a crown along the bottom. And so they tend to have their shoots jumping out from this spot in the ground, and then they have their root going down. But their roots tend to like distribute out pretty widely. Shrubs and bushes can have a lot of different sides. It's like they can be these kind of flowering bushes, or even kind of this ground shrubbery you find in like the desert. But for us, as far as our purposes go, pretty straightforward. I take something like an isosphere, like this guy right here. Maybe I move it up a little bit, and I use my sculpting tools, turn off symmetry, G for my grab tool, F to make it larger, and this is also a good time to get out your drawing tablet if you got one, and just rotate around and pull some forms until you get something that looks less like just a geometric sphere if we're keeping everything in that low poly fashion. Because you'd be surprised, this is generally more than enough to get across the impression of what we're doing when, you know, you have a couple of them. As long as they're, you know, have a greenish color to them, people kind of get the idea. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to type shrub. Now, the last of these that I'm going to work with are the trees. And trees are what we usually think of when we think about plants, especially in environments. They're large, we focus on them, we get like a lot of material from them. We think about these too, if you ever worked with wood, as like hard or soft wood. And this is generally means the difference between a coniferous tree or a deciduous tree. So coniferous trees are like pine trees, generally called softwood. Their wood is conventionally softer, although it's not always. And they tend to be called coniferous. They have also these kind of conical sections. Their anatomy is a little bit different, but it's generally kind of the same thing. We have a root system, we have a trunk, and then we have this massive branches or crown of leaves. And the same thing we have with a deciduous tree. Conventionally, coniferous trees are conical shaped, and deciduous trees are sort of have this more bulbous outline shape, but of course, that's going to be based on your research. So how do we make these? Well, I want to make use of a modifier here. I'll come back to that in a second, called the skin modifier, which is going to let us take a single chain of edges of these verts connected by edges and actually build a mesh around it. And then we can smooth it out. So by default, it looks something like this, a little line with a cube, and then we can scale those individual elements, and it makes making trees a lot faster. So I'll come back to this and say, I'm going to take this shrub, and I'm actually going to duplicate it and put it off to the side because I'm going to use it in a second. And let's go ahead and start playing with the skin modifier. So I'm going to do Shift-A, and I'm going to create a plane and tab into it. But instead of moving anything around, I'm going to hit A to get all the points, Alt-M, and all at center. Because all I want now is one single vert now at the center. I'm going to press E and Z so I can move one vert straight up. So all I have is a vert here and a line in between them. Because if I come into my modifier and I go to my skin modifier, it creates out of that a cube. And what's cool about this, let's turn this off for a second, is if I take this from, let's go into the front view, and I hit E to extrude, and I hit E to extrude, and I click back here and I hit E to extrude, and maybe I make another side here, E to extrude, E to extrude. And I can kind of branch off, literally making branches. And if I leave it on tweak here, in this setting, I can, let's turn off this proportional editing. You may see it's pretty quick to like change my shape up around. And so I can turn this back on, and I have the structure of my tree. Now it's really square, but that's where we can go ahead and add in something like a subdivision surface, which will smooth everything out. Now we get the problem of like, it's getting tree-like. And if I hit X-ray mode up here, I can see inside of it. So let's take these branches up here, I'm gonna hit B and just drag across. And I want to look at this from the top view because I want to rotate these along our 3D cursor, which is at the center. So if I rotate, I can even duplicate like so, and then rotate around. And then I can take this point and that point and hit F to connect those. And I have more tree to kind of work with here. So be that and kind of move them down and make adjustments to them as I go. What I can do now is I'm going to select all of these and hit Control A. And by dragging it, I can change their relative scale that they're doing with the skin modifier. So I start by reducing it, and then let's take these end branch points like here and Control A and get those way scaled down. And then I can Control A to scale up this part, Control A to scale this up, and that becomes the scale of my trunk. And then to get it kind of that tree trunk look, I put another one of these points in here with Control R, G, and then Z to drop it down. We can see we kind of get that tapering out effect. And you get a tree. But the nice thing is, again, because this is all based on modifiers, pretty easy to grab and move and adjust things. And just like, take a look at what your reference looks like. Making sure your branches are going where you want them to go. And are generally following. Like, we don't want them to be too linear. It would be a really boring tree if everything was just really flat. So give it plenty of directions. I want another branch shooting off. Well, I can just click this. I can press G twice, and that'll actually let me slide it along. And then that lets me go E, Control A, and I can scale things down. Let's change back to median point, Control A. And so anywhere I feel like I need to change the relative thickness of anything, I can do that. So now this is where I kept that little piece. Oh, and on the rotate points, if I select all these, see how the last one I selected is like white? That becomes my active point. So I can change from median point to active element, and that will mean this will now rotate around whatever I chose last. So I find this is pretty helpful too for making changes to branches. Like, it'll rotate around whatever point I chose last. So it can be helpful. It kind of works like that pivot thing, but it goes wherever it wants. So I can take these two, choose this last, it's the white one, and look at it. And now I know if I rotate, it'll rotate around that point. So just like some of the little tricks I use, but always make sure to kind of come back to median point because it makes more sense. Now, I've got my base of my tree. What I need now is to just take that duplicate, and that's why I put this shrub in here, because this is basically what I use when I'm making low poly trees to make the base of my geometry. Duplicate a couple of these. And then just like before, it's a matter of selecting one, coming into my sculpting mode, making sure I have everything set, and then just push and pull it around until I get some interesting shapes. We don't want it to look too obvious that this is the same object. Kind of rotate it around. So I can kind of Control Tab and go to my object mode because I'm still in sculpting mode. To swap to these, I can Control Tab to go back and forth between my edit and my sculpt mode. I'm just kind of pushing this around, thinking about it as points at a time. Wrong one. Control Tab, not Windows Tab. Control Tab to go back to object mode. Select this one. Control Tab to go back to sculpt mode. Hopefully Blender will eventually come up with a quicker way of moving between those. And then I'm going to go back to layout, and I can also just make one that kind of gives me like a crown if I want, like D, and then maybe scale it and everything but Z. And then I got a basic tree. So all that's left for me to do is kind of color things up. Of course, my branches here look a little even with the subdivision, but I know how to fix that. Just throw a decimate on it. And change my ratio till I feel like it's got more of that kind of low poly look to everything. And since everything's still, again, non-destructive, can always come back and make adjustments or changes to things however I want. So all that's left to do is take all of these objects here and just combine them. Before you combine them, you want to make sure you're applying any transforms, because otherwise, or any of these modifiers. Otherwise, it'll be a problem for you. B, take all these, Control J, and F2, and name it tree. So there you go. You can make some plants. We've got now some shrubs that I can scatter around my scene as like my ground cover. I have here a tree that I can rotate, move around, and make multiple variations of this, just like with the rocks, but with just we can see even a few of these. Let's make a nice little plane to scale everything up, because in our next section, we're going to make an actual ground for everything. You can now kind of take these and scatter them around a little bit. Take our grass and just move this around the scene. And I'll show you right when I'm working this. If we go to change this little function to face, it's actually going to drag it onto a face surface. So if I hit Control, it'll drag it onto this plane. So I can duplicate it and drag out a couple of these little grass nodes. And then let's put out some of our ferny plants. Maybe I made that a little big, so just kind of drag a couple of these around. We can see we start having the pieces that we can start making like a whole scene out of. If we combine this with our rocks, we can actually start creating some interesting nature to what we're doing. So in the next session I'm going to be showing you how we can actually generate terrain, like big environments that we can start putting our rocks and our trees into. See you next time.